Hello, take three. This is Steve Green here, and I'm here for MGST 703 Philosophy of Science, Assignment 3. Here's my video submission for your review. The working title for this assignment is The Leadership Approach Choice in Response to Socially Induced Change. And so the problem I'm seeking to address with this work is that leaders in large organizations, both private and public, face pressure from society to change organizational practice. This external pressure is often unrelated to the firm's core activities. So think of any demand that's coming from the socio-political realm on organizations to change that really don't have much to do with their organizational practice, with their core activities. What should a leader do? So my objective here is to explain how to minimize the resource use of firms and to maximize the focus of the firm in response to these demands on a firm's attention and resources. So addressing these issues, it does take resources away from the firm's core activities. And so what should a leader do? My main proposition is that when leaders choose to act decisively through policy action and clear tasks to accomplish goals related to the social political change, as opposed to choosing to act in a relational consultative approach, they decrease the resources lost and the distraction from core practices caused by the socially induced change. So think about it this way. If Edmonton Public Schools is thinking about and spending time in their management structure with how to address workplace diversity or with how to address corporate social responsibilities, are they still focusing all of their attention and energy on teaching kids how to read? Right. And so there's a trade-off of resources if management has to engage in a solution for these social political issues. And there's a trade-off in the focus of the firm that I am seeking to address. The background needed to address this question is to really look at the literature on institutional change. We're talking about large organizations, public and private. And so there's a lot written about how institutions change from external or internal forces. And clearly we're looking at an external force and how do institutions change. There's a lot written on that. And there's also some interesting current research that gets really a little bit deeper on these modern socio-political issues, such as corporate social responsibility. And so that's the background. The validation to answer this question will be found through an analysis of archival annual reports. And so I can look towards Shaw Communications and their annual reports, and Max, Alberta Health Services, and Canada Goose as some sources to address this question. All right, so a little bit more about what it is I'm saying here. So here's kind of a model. We have over here a social political demand for change. And so one example in the literature is whether to extend benefits and marriage benefits and maternity benefits and things like that to same-sex couples. Right? It would have to be written into collective agreements. It would have to be written into policy statements in order to get this. And so that would be a demand made from a socio-political change that then a leader has to decide what to do. And so the independent variable when dealing with this that I'll be looking at is the leadership approach choice. Right? And a leader can do a relational consultative leadership choice or a decisive task-driven approach. And so there's a reason that comes from the literature that I'll point to as well in a moment, why I set it up in that dichotomy that you can be relational, good feelings, or you can be task-driven, directive. Okay, so that's the independent variable. And then the dependent variables would be how do those choices impact the resources used by a firm, the focus of attentive energy of the firm, given the leadership choice. And so those would be the dependent variables to be measured. Also worth commenting on, but not necessarily measured in this approach, in this theory, is how would these decisions impact firm performance overall? To stay with the example, would one approach help kids read better if that's what the firm measures its performance on? Would one approach change the bottom line? I'm not measuring it, but theoretically there should be an impact. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And then also another result of how a leader decides to approach this social political is what does society and the societal stakeholders think of the firm's approach. Right? Is there a way that gets, increasing social capital and helps the firm look and appear better? Again, I'm not going to measure that. I'm assuming that there is an impact. And so I'll take a theoretical approach to what that impact might be, but not necessarily one that I can validate. So a little bit deeper into the background here. So I have here some of the sources that I'm using. And so if we're looking at a background on institutionalism, the population ecology of organizations from Hanna and Freeman in 1977 talks about legitimacy. And legitimacy constraints emanate from the environment. Any legitimacy an organization has been able to generate constitutes an asset in manipulating the environment. To the extent that adaptation violates legitimacy claims, it incurs considerable cost. So external legitimacy considerations are important. What this says really is that if a leader were to approach doing nothing, right, we'll just ignore the issue, maybe it'll go away, we won't have to be environmentally sustainable, we won't have to be socially responsible, that no approach could decrease a firm's legitimacy. And so really that's another assumption, is that due to legitimacy concerns, a firm must do something. Okay. Some more from the literature from 1977. Formal structure is myth and ceremony, institutional organizations. So organizations are driven to incorporate the practices and procedures defined by prevailing rationalized concepts of organizational work and institutionalized in society. Organizations that do so increase their legitimacy and their survival prospects, independent of the immediate efficacy of the acquired practices and procedures. And so the argument here that's well supported in the institutional is that firms will act even when it is counter to efficiency. Even if it is counter to productivity, firms will still act in order to secure legitimacy. Right? It is argued here in this work by Meyer and Rowan that institutional isomorphism, so the tendency for institutionals to look the same as other institutions within a field, promotes the success and survival of organizations. So firms want to act the way other firms are acting. Incorporating externally legitimated formal structures increases the commitment of internal participants and external constituents. And rationalized institutions create myths of formal structure which shape organizations. And so this interplay between an institutional approach, the isomorphism that results, can be driven by leadership choices within a firm, as it can have an impact along an institution, just as a field can have an impact on the institution. So that's kind of there's a lot there in the background of institutionalism, very interesting stuff. But there's also some current scholarship that's a little bit more on point with what it is I'm discussing. So in Saunderson and Weber, talking about organizational structure from interaction, evidence from corporate sustainability efforts, these authors ask, why do some practices within a broad domain such as sustainability become enshrined in organizational structures such as carbon dioxide reduction goals and reporting systems, while others do not? A very interesting question, but not quite the one I'm asking. So their work focuses on the internal processes through which organizations address social and environmental sustainability in particular. Building on the recognition of middle managers as important actors for pushing for sustainability initiatives from the bottom up, arguably their model downplays the importance of executive leadership. And so what I'm trying to look at is the role of executive leadership when addressing these kinds of issues, whereas these authors had looked at the role of the internal structures. A similar kind of result in the work of Briscoe and Gupta 2020, where they're looking at political ideology and corporate openness to social activism. They also looked at the entire firm and not necessarily the leaders. So in this study, they proposed that organizational political ideology will predict responses to activism. They addressed this question by introducing the notion that organizational political ideology can shape how firms respond to activist protests. And so a firm can be ideological in one way or another, and that will determine the firm's response. Whereas I'm, again, focusing on the leaders, what they do. And so they have a number of really interesting findings. Companies' activist response calculus, I like the language of that. They talk about decision makers paying attention to ideologies if the communities are of the communities which they operate. They were able to find evidence of that. Individuals at multiple levels are asked to deliberate and provide input into the formulation of an appropriate response. And so that idea is really essential to one of the things that I'm saying here, is that how we pay attention has an impact on resources, right? And so how should we pay attention? How should we respond? And what will be the impact on resources? And what will be the impact on the attention of the firm? The effects of organizational ideology are not driven by a handful of executives' personal values, but instead reflect a more sociological or collective influence of the prevailing beliefs in the organization. So again, some clear findings that they're able to support, but again, it doesn't look at leadership around this issue. So what I state is that leaders in large organizations do not have the luxury of ignoring social and political pressure to change. Indeed, one role of the leader is to decide when a social and political issue must be acted upon. The posture of statesmanship may well be appropriate for many executives, Selznick talks about in his seminal work on leadership and administration. Leaders, however, cannot bend and change based on every wind of change that society presents. Leaders must take account of the environment, adapting to its limitations as well as to its opportunities, but we must be aware of institutional surrender made in the name of organizational survival. I argue that these are choices that leaders must make. And so what should be the metrics, or what should be the heuristics that a leader is making? So about the types of ways that a leader could decide, I've kind of compartmentalized it based on the work here. A leader can impact organizational direction through their approach to leadership. My proposition continues the modelship of leadership set up by Kerr and Jeremy in 1978 in their study of substitutes for leadership. They compartmentalize the role of leader into two categories: relationship-oriented, good feelings, leadership impacts, and task-oriented, guidance, leadership impacts. I will continue this categorization of the approaches to leadership by assuming that when faced with social and political forces for change, a leader can choose to build relationships and good feelings through deliberative consultation, or a leader can choose to act decisively and guide the organization through policy and goal emphasis. I then argue that the leadership choice to gather information and then act, or to act and then gather information, has an impact on organizational attention and organizational resources. Choosing the latter, to gather information and build relationships, involves the commitment of resources and attention of the firm. Managers and consultants must deliberate with stakeholders to find out what they feel or think would be a good solution to a complex external force, right? And so that's just kind of a sampling of how resources are committed in the deliberative method, right? And that's what the hypothesis needs to test, is that deliberative method a more significant drain on resources of the firm, because it's not a focus on core practices. So I hypothesize that when faced with the external pressure to address complex issues of social and political change, an organization can choose to deliberate and engage stakeholders in the solution, or it can act quickly and decisively in response as a solution. The leadership approach will have an impact on firm focus on firm resources. So my hypothesis is that when leaders choose to act decisively, firm resources and focus dedicated to non-core activities will decrease, and that is hopefully testable and proving it can be proved false or positive. And the corollary is that when leaders act consultatively and delay decisive action, firm resources and focus dedicated to non-core activities will increase, right? And so here we have the problem, the hypothesis, and it really gets to this the challenge to validation. Okay, so I was talking about using annual archival reports to validate. Okay, so there's the source. We know that information is there. It's kind of hard to track down from the UFC, but I know it's there, and I'm going to get my hands on it. But then in the validation process, how do I discover and quantify and code the leadership approach, right? How do I really, okay, this is relational, this is task driven. How do I find that and quantify it? Will it show up in the archival data? And then also the second challenge to validation is how to discover, quantify, and code the measurement of resources and organizational focus for it to be measured, right? Well, in those annual reports, will I find enough evidence that, oh, look, this is use of firm resources, this is use of firm attention, can that even be measured? And so those are the challenges to the validation. So I look forward to working on that. Maybe you have some feedback on how I can address those challenges. But I want to, why am I studying this? Why is it important? And so I really need to go into, the reasons around this. And so back to that Formal Structure as Myth and Ceremony article, they claim back in 1977, the observation is not new that organizations are structured by phenomena in their environments and tend to become isomorphic with them. Okay, so we're going to this eventual isomorphic response. Everyone's going to kind of end up in the same place anyway, right? So what should a leader do? Powerful organizations, they claim, attempt to build their goals and procedures directly into society as institutional roles. And so I argue that in response to this pressure, leaders actually have power over this isomorphic trend within society, right? So if leaders can act, I claim, then they should, right? That they should act. And so, that's getting a values-based kind of judgment on here, but I defend that because I really want to take in the conclusion, and I do take the goal of a radical structuralist theory. I'm a radical structuralist theorist, and so that's kind of where I lead to in the conclusion here. And the goal is to explain, criticize, understand, act on the structural mechanisms that exist in the organizational world, with the ultimate goal of transforming them through collective resistance and radical change. I do believe it's a role of a leader to look not just at their organization, but also society at large, and to place some values on it to make the world better, right? And so, well, here's an example of what that could mean in this context, right? How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi really shows that taking the relational approach, convincing ourselves that we are doing something to solve the racial problem, when really all we are doing is something to satisfy our feelings, right? Less impact. The problems of inequity and injustice persist. He argues very strongly that only policy change helps groups. Should anti-racism, for an example, corporate social responsibility, for another example, environmental sustainability, for another example, should these policy changes be enacted, right? And so he claims, what if we focused our human and fiscal resources on changing power and policy to actually make society, not just our feelings, better? And I hope to argue decisively that, yeah, leaders have an opportunity to wield that power and use it to, have a positive change. And it's at the behest, it's at the response of, remember, this isn't a leader deciding things. A leader is responding to the social political change demand that is already there. Right? This isn't the leader coming up with this stuff. The leader is responding to this stuff, which I believe in a democracy of informed citizens is a valid reason to change. Not only will firms where leaders act decisively and implement change through actionable and measurable tasks be able to focus more clearly on their core activities, right? That's the hypothesis to be measured. They will also be implementing positive change that the free and rational thinkers of democratic societies demand, and drive the institutional change of their industry in the right direction. Thanks so much for listening. I look forward to hearing some feedback if you choose to watch, and